Well, good evening, everybody. It's good to see you. Thank you for sitting as requested. Had the subtle tape to keep you out. We go subtle here, neon orange. But no, we do appreciate it. It makes a huge difference to take this number of people and spread them all over the auditorium. That is a terrible environment for teacher and student. So at least squeezing into this area is really helpful. So thank you for doing that. This is, if I can go the right direction, there you go. This is the Ecclesiastes class. You will not hurt my feelings if you realize, oops, I meant to be in a different class. You don't have that many options. In Building C right over here, there's a church history class you can go to. There's a parenting class, so if Joe invited you and you forgot, you can go over there. And then there's the college class, which isn't meeting today. So it's either here or the church history class for most of you. So glad to have you here. There are some books on the back that came in. You don't have to have them today, but you can get them on your way out. More on that in just a second. But there's some books on the back table. Yes, ma'am. Are they out? Okay. There's copies of the first chapter, which is what we're doing today and Wednesday. So there's still some of those copies back there. You can at least grab those if you don't have a book. And we'll get more books then. So good to have you. Good to have you here. Let's start with a prayer, and then we'll get right into an intro to Ecclesiastes. Let's pray. Our good Father, we are grateful for this Lord's Day and this new year. And we want to approach it submissive to your leadership and to your shepherding of us and to Jesus as our King. And we do pray for wisdom as we enter this year to learn from the past, not only our own, but so many who went before us. And by your providence and by your Spirit, preserved your wisdom for us. As we pray to learn this trimester from this great book, to learn you and what you teach us through it. In Jesus' name. Amen. All right. So Ecclesiastes, a little bit just sort of general stuff about it. It's an example of wisdom literature, which is a whole class of ancient literature known as wisdom literature. One of the oldest human civilizations known was Sumer. It's the area of the world that we know as Mesopotamia, if you know that term. So this area all over here, you know those names, Babylon and Elam, and, well, maybe not Elam, but Babylon we know, and Assyria, and the land of Ur. Sumer was all this area, the area between the Tigris and Euphrates. And so Sumerians have a pretty good body of literature that we've found and been able to, people who do this, able to interpret. That is wisdom literature. And it's full of things like proverbs and philosophical musings about the importance of life and the meaning of life. There's a lot of that, and it's really old, well over 2,000 years before the birth of Christ. And that's known as wisdom literature of the Sumerians. Elba, which was a very prominent city in Sumer, also had a pretty good body of literature, and we have that. And some of that literature is clearly wisdom literature, people musing and pining over the big questions of life. Babylon, and just put those on the back table, I guess, and then we'll let people get them as they leave. Yeah, thanks, Adam. Babylon and Assyria, other really ancient cultures. They had a good body of literature. Egypt, really old culture. So the point is, when you open the book of Ecclesiastes, it's not a totally unique type of literature. There's a lot of that in the ancient world, ancient literature, which is people in their day, like philosophers in our day, trying to figure out what's important and how do you explain what seems to be contradictory things. Evil is rewarded, good is not. You can set them on the table for now, Willie. That's all right. Thanks, brother. And we'll just let people get them as they leave tonight. And so Ecclesiastes is part of this big body of literature that we know as wisdom literature. It's also poetry. So what are the books of poetry of the Old Testament? There's roughly 5 of them, right? The books of poetry include Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, Job, yeah. Now there's a lot more poetry in the Old Testament than that. The prophets are full of poetry. But poetry you read differently than prose because it's poetry. And so there's lots of imagery in it. And you read it just like we read poetry different in our day, right, than they did in theirs. So it's wisdom literature, it's heavily poetic. And so that's helpful to remember that's the kind of literature that we're studying. All those other civilizations had their wisdom literature, and Israel knew it. They were exposed to it. And we understand that. Even before or after Solomon, you see references to the wisdom of this, the wisdom of these people, the wisdom of these people. Let's just read this little quote from 1 Kings chapter 4 and verse 30. In 1 Kings chapter 3, Solomon had he's made his famous request for wisdom. And his fame begins to spread. So here in chapter 4 and verse 30, so that Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the people of the East and all the wisdom of Egypt. What's the wisdom of the East? Yeah, this. All the ancient areas, Babylon and Assyria and all the ancient Sumerians. That's the literature. That's the wisdom we're talking about. So the Israelites knew that. It had been around a long time. It had made its way culturally, as information did even then. And the wisdom of Egypt had made its way up. And all of that influenced the people of Israel. Certainly, of course, they had lived in Egypt, so they had heavily influenced by the time Solomon was born. So the key here is that Ecclesiastes is wisdom literature, like much of ancient literature, but unique in ancient wisdom literature. For the wisdom of Solomon surpassed all of that. And for one fundamental reason, of course, why did he surpass the wisdom of all those others to the east and down southwest in Egypt? Simply because it was from God, right? It was from God. And that makes, of course, all the difference in the world. And that difference will be a key even as we go through this book of Ecclesiastes. Wisdom literature is elsewhere outside the big five of the Old Testament. For instance, if you remember Jotham in the book of Judges, that's when Abimelech, that friendly neighborhood Abimelech, comes to reign in Judges. It may have been a while since you remember Judges. Abimelech was whose son? Remember? He was this child by a servant of, maybe a concubine, of Gideon. And he got a bunch of guys together and say, hey, I want to be your king, help me out. And they gave him a bunch of money, and he went down and hired a bunch of mean guys, and they went and killed every other son, except one, Jotham. And the men of Shechem helped Abimelech do that. It's been a while since we've done Judges. And so Jotham, the lone remaining child of that rather extensive family, 70 sons, goes down, stands on the mountain, and makes this big decree. Let's just read it real quick, and you'll see this is kind of how the wisdom literature people talk. Judges chapter 9. Let's just read, we won't read all of it, but just sort of get an idea. Judges chapter 9, and look at verse 7. And what we have in Judges 9, verse 7. Now when they told Jotham, he went and stood at the top of Mount Gerizim and lifted his voice and cried out. And he said to them, listen to me, you men of Shechem, that God may listen to you. The trees once went forth to anoint a king over them. And they said to the olive tree, reign over us. But the olive tree said to them, should I cease giving my oil with which they honor God and men and go sway over trees? Then the tree said to the fig tree, you come and reign over us. But the fig tree said to them, should I cease my sweetness and my good fruit and go to sway over trees? So he tells this story about the trees looking for a ruler. And they go to the olive tree, they go to the fig tree, then they go to the vine, and then finally in verse 14 they appeal to a bramble. And they say, bramble, you come and reign over us. So he's comparing Abimelech to a bramble bush, which is pretty much useless. And he says, that's the king you've chosen for you. And so he gives this really sort of poetic imagery of decreeing. And then at the end, in verse 16, he declares, now therefore, if you have acted in truth and sincerity in making Abimelech your king, and if you have dealt well with Jerubbaal and his house, you have done to him as he deserves. Verse 19, if you have acted in truth and sincerity with Jerubbaal and with his house this day, then rejoice in Abimelech and let him rejoice in you. But if not, let fire come from Abimelech and devour the men of Shechem and Beth Millo, and let fire come from the men of Shechem and Beth Millo and devour Abimelech. And then Jotham ran away and fled, which makes sense. So essentially, he wants to deliver this message to these people who have helped Abimelech become king, who is a terrible guy. And he does it in this poem. of trees looking for a king and appealing to this one that has some value to it, and this has some value, and this has some value, and then to this has no value at all, and giving it its king. He said, all right, if what you did was truthful and sincere, good. If not, you're both going to be consumed. And in the end, that's what happens in the story of Abimelech. So that's really kind of what the wise man's craft of speaking. That's a good example of that, right? Tell stories, make points in images and parables and riddles and images. That's what Ecclesiastes does in many ways, and that's what wisdom literature does in many ways. And so you see that other places in the Old Testament. You see it with Nathan's parable to David. When David, in 1 Samuel chapter 24, he's hiding in the cave, and Saul goes into the cave to take care of his needs, as we were told, right? And David slices off the corner of his robe, and Saul leaves, and Saul goes out. And in the middle of all that, David refers to the proverb of the ancients, which is interesting. David knew proverbs from cultures. This was some classic proverb, and he quotes it there in 1 Samuel chapter 24 and verse 13 to help explain why he's not going to kill, why he didn't kill King Saul when he had the chance to do that. So, wisdom literature was common, and they knew it, and they were familiar with that of other cultures and other histories, centuries before them, sometimes perhaps millennium before them. And so Ecclesiastes is part of this family of stuff. The Psalms are full of wise sayings of people. Moses wrote Psalm 90. Solomon wrote at least two of them, we know, Psalm 72 and 127. And I mentioned Ethan and Heman for a reason. They each wrote one psalm that we know of, Psalm 88 and 89. I say that because, again, you go back to Kings, when they describe Solomon's wisdom, this is how they describe Solomon. He was wiser than all men, than Ethan the Ezrahite, and Heman, Chalcol and Darda, the sons of Mahal, and his fame was in all the surrounding nations. So right after telling us his wisdom surpassed that of the wise men of the east and of Egypt, the very next verse says, and he surpassed all the wise men of Israel, including Heman and Ethan, who we know of in the Psalms. They each wrote a psalm. So they were pretty well-known wise men of their culture, and Solomon surpassed all of them. So it gives us a context of what we're approaching when you approach Ecclesiastes. Maybe a unique book to us, but to them, pretty common type of literature, pretty type of musings. All right, good. Good basic introduction there, I think. What word might we use for things like the questions that Solomon asked in Ecclesiastes in our day? Who asks those kinds of questions? What's the meaning of life? Yeah, it's really philosophy. That's where we put that, is in the study of philosophy. And that's really what it is. What's life all about? That's what modern day philosophers and even ancient philosophers tried to do. Let me find my way back. This Bible I have, sometime last year I ripped the ribbon out of it accidentally. And so now whenever I move to a page, I can't just flip back. I could put a bookmark in it, but I didn't think to do that. So here I am flipping it back and forth. All right. We do have Willie with a microphone, so if anyone has a comment or an insight as we go through this, raise your hand, and he'll run down the aisle and get the microphone to you, because I'd like to hear what you have to say on some of this as well. Ecclesiastes is also known as a type of literature known as pessimist literature. Now, why would it say that? Why is Ecclesiastes, you know Ecclesiastes, pessimist literature? Yeah, the word meaningless comes up a lot. Right? Yeah, it has a strong negative slant to it. You read the book, and it's kind of a lot of it can be kind of a downer. At least the mood of the book is a downer. The writing, yeah, it's really kind of it's a pessimistic book in many ways. And again, that's not unique. Egypt had a writing known as The Man Who Was Tired of Life. I've never read that one, but hey, maybe you can find it on the internet somewhere. Babylon had The Counsels of a Pessimist, and that was theirs. The same kind of questions. What are we doing? What is this all about anyway? We have all this history, all this empire. It's just repeating itself. Who cares? You may have heard of the Epic of Gilgamesh before. It's a significant body of literature, and it's really famous. Portions of that are really pessimistic. And it's the same kind of observations. We're all doing the same thing everyone else has done. My life is not going to make any difference in this world. No one's going to remember me. I don't remember anybody else who went before. Basically, there's nothing new. Those same kind of questions are being kicked around in other kinds of nations. Is that surprising that Ecclesiastes is not unique in asking those kinds of questions? Or is that somewhat expected? Yeah, it should be expected, right? Because we're people. And all people and all cultures find themselves at some point, those who think, realizing, wait a minute, why am I working so hard? Why am I working so hard for this? I see my neighbor working what Solomon did, working. He has no family. And he's getting money and money. Why is he doing that? And he's doing nothing with it. What's this all about anyway? And just watching the world. The wind blows and it comes back, and the rivers flow and it comes back, and the rain comes and it goes. People have those same questions because we're human beings, right? And so all cultures were looking for answers to that, those kinds of questions. So Ecclesiastes is part of this, again, pretty well-known view of pessimistic literature, pretty common motif in literature of pessimism. All right, so for this class, we're going to use this book. Some of you got it on the way in. There's maybe a couple copies left on that back table on the way out. If so, feel free to grab them. We'll try to get some more. Wilson Adams wrote it. He's preached a long time. Any of y'all know Wilson? Okay, he's been around a good long. He's preached in Texas. He's preached in Tennessee. I think some in Kentucky. Good man. And he's written a whole set of class materials. There were some other books on these tables that were not the Ecclesiastes book. It was a church history book, which they're using over there. So if those books remain, just look at the title and make sure it looks like this. On the front, and says, Ecclesiastes on the front. Should be a pretty good giveaway, but when you're chasing kids or spouses or whatever, and you just see a book and grab it, it's easy to grab the wrong thing. It's put really straightforward. There's 12 chapters in Ecclesiastes. There's 12 lessons in the book, one for each chapter, which lines up perfectly with our schedule because we're going to miss 1 week in it. So if you happen to be out, it's easy to know what the schedule is. Just start with January 1, and that's chapter 1. And it's a chapter a week. It's how he breaks it down. So that's how we'll be studying through this book. Here's the schedule. You can't really see that very well. But just for fun, there it is. The week in yellow is the FC lecture week. So we won't meet classes that week. We'll have guest speakers, I think, during our times. Other things going on during class sessions that week. So it breaks it down. And I'm teaching some. You'll see Bill and Gary are teaching as well. We each end up teaching the equivalent of 4 weeks. So, there you go. And if you would like a copy of that, let me or Gary and Bill know. We'll be glad to email it to you. But otherwise, it's pretty straightforward. If you want to avoid when Bill's teaching, just let me know. I'll give it to you. Gary also had a really good suggestion to remind you, this is not the first time we've taught wisdom literature at Livingston. And so there's a library of Bible studies on the website. So if you're a newer member and you haven't logged in yet, Michael Gordon can help you get set up. But if you do know how to access that, over here in the right menu bar, there will be a members-only sermons and Bible classes option. You can click on that. You can come up here and search. I think this one is searched by title of a class, and it's wisdom and something, literature. I forget what it says. Wisdom and something. Search for that, and you can pull up whatever those previous classes were. And some of those might tie in well with this class. So if you have time to do that, you're in the car, you want to listen to it or whatever, there it is. So it's a really good resource. So thanks, Gary, for reminding us of that. All right, any questions just on logistics as far as that goes, as far as basic schedule, book, teachers? All right. So let's start talking a little bit about the book itself. Let's just turn to Ecclesiastes and read a little bit. Not much, because we're going to discuss most of chapter 1 on Wednesday, but we'll get a little bit of groundwork going here. All right, let's just read the first few verses of Ecclesiastes. Chapter 1. I'm reading out of the New King James. So, the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanity, says the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What profit has a man from all his labor in which he toils under the sun? One generation passes away and another generation comes, but the earth abides forever. The sun also rises and the sun goes down and hastens to the place where it arose. The wind goes toward the south and turns around to the north. The wind whirls about continually. It comes again on its circuit. All the rivers run into the sea, yet the sea is not full. To the place from which the rivers come, there they return again. All things are full of labor. Man cannot express it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. That which has been is what will be. That which is done is what will be done. And there's nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which it may be said, see, this is new? It has already been in ancient times before us. There is no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of things that are to come by those who will come after. And that's kind of an intro to the book. And then it shifts in verse 12 to first person. I, the preacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem. So, whose words are we reading when we read Ecclesiastes? According to Ecclesiastes, the preacher. The preacher. Right. The Hebrew word is koheleth for that. Sometimes you'll hear that referred to. The writer of Ecclesiastes, the speaker of Ecclesiastes is koheleth. There are questions about who actually wrote it. Most people say Solomon wrote it. Wilson says so. I'll say so. I don't get into a whole lot of discussion about the authorship and all that. If you you can dive as deep as you want to dive into that, all you want. I'll tell you a little bit about why there's some debate about it. One is there's times in this book where the preacher is spoken of in third person, like at the very beginning. Right in the middle of the book. I think here in chapter 7, yeah. Here's what I have found, says the preacher, adding one thing to the other to find out the reason, that and it goes on. That sounds like somebody's recording what the preacher said, rather than the preacher speaking of himself, because we don't typically refer to ourselves in third person. Maybe some of you do that, but it's a little odd. We don't do that. Although in literature, that sometimes is done. Sometimes the author will play sort of a dual role because it's literature and it's poetry, and you do that sometimes in literature and poetry, where you speak in first person, then you also speak as though you're an editor or as though you're a third person looking in, but it's really the same author. So the Solomon writer people will say that's what Solomon's doing, and that's not like a really hard thing to imagine somebody doing, especially in a poetic type of literature. Others will say, yeah, that seems weird. Why would he talk about himself third person right in the middle of where we have chapter 7? So there's a little bit of debate about that, but it doesn't matter, really. I think it's Solomon, but it doesn't really matter. But it's the preacher. So we have the words of the preacher, who we know was the son of David and the king in Israel. So that helps you narrow it down to, a book of wisdom, someone who excelled in all wisdom above everybody else around them. That just has to be Solomon, right? Who else could claim that, right? Theoretically, some other ruler could claim that, but that's got to be Solomon. So we have this preacher thing, and it comes up, and we're reminded in the book. At the very beginning, it's the preacher. Here in chapter 7, in the middle is the preacher. Then at the very end, as he's reaching his conclusions, he reminds us again who's speaking here. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher, and moreover, this is another third person section. Because the preacher was wise, such and such, the preacher sought to find acceptable words. So the preachers who we're listening to in this book, Koheleth is his name, the preacher. If I were to ask you, what key words do you think of when you think of Ecclesiastes? What words come to mind? What phrases or words from the book itself come to mind? What's the vanity? Good. Vanity's a biggie, right? Which one? Wisdom. Good. Wisdom. Yeah. Vanity. Wisdom. Under the sun. Because there's context for this, right? And the writer, the preacher, gives us that context. When I considered all things under the sun, and that matters. We'll see, in fact, that makes all the difference in the world in this book and how he views what's going on. After all any of us can see is what's under the sun. That's what we can see. And that's what he's referencing, is what he sees in life. And that's what any of us can see. So, vanity comes up. Yeah, under the sun comes up. Wisdom comes up. I didn't put that up here, but I should. What other key word? Doesn't come up very often, but it does come up, particularly in the most pivotal moments of the book, perhaps of the book. I'm fishing for what I put down, which you don't know, but give it anybody want to take a swing? What other kind of word that's, oh, God, I've seen, good. Toil's a great one. Yeah. Time is, it's God. Yeah, remember is a good one. Remember is a great one. That's where it comes up, right? Is in reference to God, the word remember. It's like that. It's the answer all kids give in Bible class, right? Because you got about an 80% chance of being right. Just say God. Well, okay, yeah, but. Kids do that in college, too. When I teach college, they'll throw out whatever we're studying, ATP or mitochondria. I'm like, well, yeah, but, I mean, come on. Give me the real answer. So these are three key words in the book that help guide us as we read this and figure out what is Solomon thinking? Why is he thinking that way? And how can I think then? How am I a better thinker because of this? So we already read it once. To what extent does vanity fill, at least at times, the preacher's view of the world? To what extent does vanity fill his vision? All of it. That's right. Everything's vanity. All of it. That's pretty excessive, right? That's extreme. Everything under the sun, useless, futile, pointless, valueless. That's what vanity means. All of it. And he uses a pretty strong imagery, we'll see here in a second, to explain just how far he takes that. Under the sun, there is zero value in this life. You may know the passage we're going to read in a second. How does he depict that in this book when he tries to see? He is grasping at wind, which is futile. He speaks of a type of person who's at the most advantage. Of all people, which person has the greatest advantage? Right. The one who's never been born is better off than everybody else. That's pretty dark. That's just a little on the gloomy scale, right? It'd be better to have never been born. That's where he is, as we'll see that in just a second. So when he says all is vanity, there's no value under the sun, there are moments in this when that's what he feels. That's what he believes. And that's not unique to ancient literature as well. I forget which of those ancient writings I referred to includes this, but basically at the end of it, it concludes, let's just commit suicide, because that's really what we ought to do. And it's set up as a dialogue between two men talking about the meaning of life, which another really common way, that's how Plato wrote. Plato wrote there's people talking. That's how he described his philosophy. And so there's this ancient literature that did the same thing. At the end, these two guys are talking, and they both basically agree, let's just kill ourselves, because there's no point in living, and really the best thing is to die. And that's how the book ends. I mean, right? That's not good, right? Not good. But that's where the preacher was, at least in some of his thought process in this book. It's important for us to see that, because that's real. That can become a real thing. As we think, what's the meaning of life? What gives life meaning? And you can get to the point, can't we, that life has no meaning. I probably ought to just die. And that's a hard place to be, even philosophically. But when God inserts, when God makes his way into the thought, and genuine faith in God is put, he changes everything. God changes everything for this book. And he changes everything for those who think through these kinds of questions. Why is my life meaningful? Is it meaningful? When I die, what difference is that going to make? The fact that I was born, what difference did that make? God changes all of that. And he rushes meaning and significance and value into a place where the preacher saw none, until God inserts there. And then suddenly, life is worth living, and my life is valuable, and makes all the difference. And that's as big a lesson out of this book as anything, right? Is God makes the difference, and we'll see this. All right, anyone with a thought or a comment right now about some of this stuff? It's kind of philosophical thinkings, but all right, let me know when you do. Y'all are smart people, and you're good-thinking people. So when you have a thought, okay, hey, Willie, just bring the thing up here real quick to Paul. You are smart people, and you are good-thinking people. So when you have a thought, it's always helpful.
As we were talking about the idea that Ecclesiastes is pessimist literature,
Yeah.
I think most of the time as Christians, we almost place an expectation on ourselves and each other to be positive people because we're so blessed, and we all experience trials in our life. And I think one of the beauties of God's word is that He has provided us with everything that we might experience, including this idea of, well, what's the point? And without pulling back the curtain too much on what you're going to do over the next 13 weeks, at the beginning He says it's all pointless, and at the end He tells us, but here's the answer to that.
Right.
And so it's like, while there are challenges we're going to face on this earth, and there's going to be those times where we have a pessimistic outlook on things, God has provided us with the roadmap to get out of that. And while there are many passages in the Bible that may help people in different ways, Ecclesiastes is one to me that seems really clear to take somebody from that point of, apathy or pessimism to, okay, things aren't as bad as I thought they were, or things are really good.
Right. Good. Thank you, Paul. That's right. And yeah, Ecclesiastes is not an unknown book to all of you. You've been through this book before, you've studied, you know the beginning and the end, right? But it's worth diving in here and considering these kinds of questions as they do. Yeah, Tom?
I was thinking about scientists and the pursuit of the furthest reaches of the universe. And when you're pursuing that, not taking God into account, all you're left with is, how did that happen, and what's next? What is next? What is next? And then when God is put into the picture, it's like, what else did He do? This is magnificent.
Yeah, right.
It's like discovering a painting and denying that it had a painter. And there's no value to it. There's mystery. But when you discover who the painter is, you want to see what else has that painter done. Right. What has he done?
Right. I love that image. That's great. And you're right. That's right. And it gives us our little life on this pale blue dot, as Carl Sagan described it. And it's really less than that in the cosmos. Significance and meaning, because there's a God out there who did all that. Thank you, Tom. All right, so I look forward to studying this with you. It's going to be, I think, really interesting. There are some challenges in studying this book. One is the apparent, the very real oscillation in tone sometimes, which we've already referred to. So here's this passage in chapter 4 that you all mentioned, Gary reminded us of earlier. Therefore, I praise the dead who are already dead, more than the living who are still alive, yet better than both is he who's never existed, who has not seen the evil work that's done under the sun. Those people who are already dead, they're better off than the living. Better yet are those who were never even born. I mean, that's a pretty gloomy place to be, right? Efforts, what it means to be a human being. But then, a few chapters later, in chapter 5, or next chapter later, here's what I've seen. It is good and fitting for one to eat and drink and to enjoy the good of all his labor in which he toils under the sun, all the days of his life, which God gives him, for it is his heritage. So now, it is a good thing to be alive, and it's a good thing to enjoy the blessings that God gives to you. So a very different tone. It leads some people to argue, in fact, that there's different writers of the book, because there's a really pessimistic writer, and then there's the more optimistic writer. I don't think at all there's any reason to think that different guys wrote it. It's one person working through these kinds of questions, which think one way and you end up sort of in one place, think a different way, you end up in a different place. You have a similar kind of comment in chapter 8 of Ecclesiastes. Turn over there near the end. And verse... Well, I thought it was chapter 8. Well, maybe it wasn't chapter 8. There's another very positive one. I thought it was chapter 8, but it may have been a different chapter that I was just looking at this afternoon. Anyway, other than chapter 5, there's other positive moments in this book. It's also challenging to outline. A couple, including our book. Our lesson book has an outline, somewhat, of this book. You look at different commentaries, they try to outline it in different ways. Some commentators will say, here's an outline, but look, 50 different guys will give you 50 different outlines. It's just a challenging book to try to outline. can mean when you read it, it might seem a little herky-jerky in some ways. Maybe it will. It may not to you. You may read it and it flows very well. Some people may read it and think, well, it seems like it's sort of bouncing around. If so, that's just the way it is, right? That's how we think sometimes. So don't let that stop you. Read this book. And like all books, the more we read it, the more familiar we'll become with it, and we'll start seeing connections and things that maybe we didn't see before. The way I use the lesson book, different teachers use the lesson books differently. I tend not to, this book will have discussion questions at the end, like most lesson books do. I tend not to just walk through those one after the other. In the lesson book, that's not how I approach it. So, but I do refer to them. And usually I'll pick my favorites out of there maybe and work those in as we discuss whatever text we're studying. Bill and Gary may prefer just to go through the questions like that when the time comes. And there's value in that. I probably just don't think that linearly. I'm a little scattered perhaps, but that's not how I use it. So this is my recommendation each week. Try to just read through the book once a week. It's not a very long book in your Bible. If you pay, just read through it. In the chapter we're studying that week, of course, pay particular attention to that one. And then I would, after reading through that, I would spend some time in our lesson book and read Wilson's comments on it, jot down your thoughts to the questions, jot down your other questions, because you're going to have some. Questions are going to come up, of course. And the best learning comes when we start asking questions. The best learning comes. And I'm not at all afraid, if you ask me a question, to say, I don't know. And if you ask me a question I don't know, I'll just tell you, I don't know. And that's a good opportunity to have other people perhaps comment or to revisit that question. And that's where the best learning comes from. But I think the best thing to do in learning the Bible is to read it. Read it a lot. So if you can get a process where you read through Ecclesiastes once a week, by the end of the semester you will have read through it several times, if you don't miss hit every week. And it's going to make a whole lot more sense. And you're going to see so much more in it than any of us do if we just read through it one chapter at a time, one chapter a week. So that's what I would encourage you to do that way. That's how I tend to approach it. Okay, good. All right, got a few minutes. Good. Any questions or comments before we step forward? All right, let's just get started in chapter 1. That was all intro things. I had thought about asking you the question, why did you choose this class? Why Ecclesiastes? A lot of you have studied it before. Some of you have studied it many times. But then I realized, well, you really only had one other option. It's a church history class, and it's limited in space and maxes out, so you may be here by default. So here you are, right? So I decided I'm not going to ask that question. Why are you here? Because I had to be. I get that at work all the time. So, why are you taking biology? Because they made me. I was like, okay, no, so be it. Still could be fun. So let's look at Ecclesiastes chapter 1, those first 11 verses we just read. Just skim through that. There are two key questions. Well, just two questions, I think, that's all, that he asks in that first section. What are those questions? What are the two questions he asks? All right, so one thing is, what does man gain? Or what profit does a man have from all his labor? That's verse 3. And then he has some comments following that. What's his second question? Is there anything of which we can say, hey, this is new? Is there anything of which we can say this is new? This section serves as a prologue for the whole book in many ways, these first 11 verses. And those two key questions, I think, help set up the book. So what profit is there from all the labor that we labor? That's the New King James Version. What profit has a man from all his labor? Verse 3. And then, is there anything new under the sun? And his answer to is there anything new is no, there's not. Is there anything new in our life really that other people haven't really experienced? No, not really. I mean, technology's new. I don't know what else is new. Technology's new. Yeah. Advances are new, but it's variations on the theme. Communication is not new. The same issues you have on the phone communication, you've always had in communication. Overspeaking, gossiping, underspeaking, lying, immoral things, praise, good thing. it's all the same. It's just that communication is the same. Yes, Willie, can you bring the mic down over here? Willie, over here on this. Marilyn would like to comment over here. It's a well, good. Question's even better. So yeah, there's nothing new, and that's correct in many ways. Yes, ma'am.
This may be silly, but you said technology is new, but on the other hand, it may not be new. We just don't know. We don't know what's out there in the air. God knows what's out there, and man has discovered it. What do you think of that thought?
Well, as far as we know, iPhones have never existed until the last 15 years or so.
Okay,
Right, that kind of thing.
yeah, okay.
That kind of thing. That's what I meant by
But
modern
the
technology.
wavelengths and all the things out there we didn't know were there are making it possible. Is that right?
Well, yes, that kind of energy has been around. Right. The kind of energy that allows that to work has always been there. We're just applying it differently. That's true. So even technology uses stuff that's always been around. Yeah. So let those two questions sort of help guide your reading this week as we go through chapter 1. Just, of course, keep going through there. What's the profit of labor? And then he uses multiple images to illustrate that. Everything's a cycle. Everything's a cycle on the earth. In fact, in biology, you learn some of those, right? There's the water cycle. How many of y'all had to learn the water cycle at some point? Yeah, the water cycle, yeah. None of you learned you hate it so much you won't admit it. It's because you're so cool. Everybody knows that. But there's, yeah. So, and I tell you what, as deep as you go chemically, it's the same thing. It's the same thing. Not to go all science nerd on you, but the trees outside are built of carbon that animals at one point breathed out. And the stuff that's powering you, the carbon that you're breathing out is what you ate a few hours ago, and that's going to become a tree somewhere eventually. Right? It's all the same thing. It's just churning around, same stuff. And it's as big as you go. It's all the same thing, just turning around. And so he uses the idea of water, right? The rivers never stop. They keep going. That means something's feeding that river, and we know that. It's a water cycle. And we know the wind never stops. There's circuit. It just runs. And there's a good lesson in that. What else does he use? He uses what? The sun, thank you. The sun, same rotation, right? All the time. And then there's life. And every week we see people pass away, and every week we see new people born. It's the same cycle. It's the same cycle. And at the end of it, he says, we can see and hear a lifetime of this. See and hear a lifetime. At the end, we're seeing and hearing the same stuff. And it's wearing me out. It's monotonous. And welcome to the Ecclesiastes, right? And that's when in verse 12 of this book, then he starts, so I, the preacher, was king over Israel and Jerusalem, and I set my heart to seek and search out by wisdom concerning all that's done under heaven, this burdensome task God has given to the sons of man, by which they may be exercised. I've seen all the works that are done under the sun, and indeed all is vanity and grasping for the wind. And he continues on. And he begins to outline then, really starting here at the end of chapter 1, and then going into chapter 2, look, I tried this, and I tried this, and I tried this, and I tried all these things, looking for significance or meaning, and at the end, the answer is always the same. So that's the setup, and that's how we'll start approaching it. Okay, we've got about 2 minutes left. Any closing comment? Otherwise, we'll just end a little early in here and wait for others to make their way back in. Okay, we have one back here with Tim. Thanks, Willie.
Being a former educator, speaking to one that's current.
Right.
The last verse is interesting. The more learning, the worse it gets.
Yep.
Paraphrase.
Yep.
That's challenging, so that would not be encouraging for a parent to say, hey, the more you learn about this, the better it is. But again, if you watch evening news, for instance, the more we see what's going on,
Yeah.
Darker it gets. But there is value in learning, so I think that's a key.
Yeah. And we'll talk about that some Wednesday night. That is a key verse. He looked for learning. We are a very highly educated society, comparatively. Americans are very highly educated, comparatively. And we're a wreck. Our culture is a wreck. And it's the education leaders who are wrecking it the most. Look at what we figured out. And you talk about vanity and striving and grasping after wind. It's nuts. It's nuts. And we'll talk about that idea. Education is deeply valuable. Yeah, it's incredibly valuable. But it's not meaning. It doesn't give you meaning. It's not where the answers are found. It's not an education. So we'll talk about that. Thanks, Tim. All right. See y'all Wednesday.